In the year 910, somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 Viking warriors crossed into the English heartland. They were led by 2 kings and at least 3 earls, the largest concentrated Viking leadership in a single army Britain had seen in a generation. Not a single one of those kings made it home alive. Here's the thing that doesn't make sense. The Vikings knew where the English army was. They had intelligence, they had scouts. They knew King Edward the Elder, Alfred the Great's son, was stuck in Kent, waiting on a fleet that hadn't arrived. His main fighting force was tied up with those ships hundreds of miles away. So the Vikings did what Vikings do. They marched deep into Mercia, modern-day central England, and they took everything: gold, silver, livestock, slaves. They burned what they couldn't carry and laughed at the English who couldn't stop them. And then they turned around to go home. That's when they walked into the most devastating ambush in Viking Age. History. How do you catch an army that's expecting you to be somewhere else? How do you coordinate forces across 2 kingdoms without radios, without telegraphs, without any of the things we take for granted? And how do you kill 2 kings in a single afternoon? The answer is a military trap so perfectly executed that it essentially broke the Viking North for an entire generation. Historians call it Tettenhall, or Wensfield, or Vodnesfeld, depending on which chronicle you read. I call it the battle that proved Edward the Elder wasn't just Alfred's son. He was something worse. To understand what happened at Tettenhall, you need to understand the world Alfred the Great left behind when he died in 899. And here's the truth nobody likes to admit. Alfred didn't unify England, not even close. When Alfred died, England was still 3 separate worlds. In the south, you had Wessex, Alfred's kingdom, the last Anglo-Saxon realm that hadn't fallen to the Vikings. In the middle, you had Mercia, technically allied with Wessex, ruled by Alfred's daughter Ethelfled and her husband Ethelred. And in the north and east, the Danelaw, Viking territory, a patchwork of Norse kingdoms and earldoms that answered to no single king. Alfred had beaten the Vikings. He'd forced them to accept boundaries, but he hadn't destroyed them. Now his son Edward sat on the throne of Wessex, 20-something years old, untested in major command, surrounded by enemies who'd spent decades fighting his father. And here's what the Vikings were thinking. Alfred was the problem. Alfred was the genius. Alfred was the one who'd built the fortresses and trained the armies, and somehow, impossibly, held the line when every other English kingdom fell. But Alfred was dead. Maybe his son was softer. The peace that existed in 910 wasn't really peace. It was a Viking peace, which meant it lasted exactly as long as it took for them to get bored. The Northumbrian Danes, based around York, had been restless for years. Small raids, probing attacks, testing the borders, seeing what they could get away with. In 909, Edward tested back. He launched a raid north into the Danelaw, not a massive invasion, but something more pointed. His forces hit the monastery at Bardney in Lincolnshire and took something the Vikings considered theirs, the relics of St. Oswald. Now, you might think, relics, bones, who cares? Everyone cared. Relics were power. They were legitimacy. They were proof that God favored your kingdom over your enemies. Taking St. Oswald's relics was Edward saying, I can reach into your territory and take what I want, and you can't stop me. It was a deliberate provocation. The Vikings decided it was time to respond. In 910, the Northumbrian Danes assembled the largest army they'd gathered in years. This wasn't a raid, this was a statement. 2 kings led the force, Eowils and Halfdan. These weren't minor chieftains. These were the rulers of the Danish North, the men who controlled York and commanded the loyalty of thousands. With them came earls, Otter, Skurfa, and others whose names the chronicles didn't bother to record. Behind them marched somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 warriors, veterans, men who'd grown up raiding, who'd cut their teeth on English villages, who knew exactly how to break a shield wall. And they had intelligence. Their scouts reported something beautiful. Edward was in Kent. His army was assembling a naval force on the southern coast. The fleet was delayed. Bad weather, supply problems, the usual chaos of medieval logistics. The English king was stuck. His main army was hundreds of miles away, waiting on ships that weren't ready. The calculation was simple. The math was obvious. The Mercians alone couldn't stop an army this size. By the time Edward got his forces moving, the Vikings would be home with their plunder. This was free loot. This was easy money. This was everything the Vikings had done for 100 years. They crossed into Mercia and started taking everything they could carry. The Viking army pushed deep, deeper than they'd gone in years. They moved through what's now Staffordshire and Worcestershire, all the way to the River Severn. That's over 100 miles into English territory. That's not a raid, that's an occupation. And they operated exactly like Vikings always operated. Fast, brutal, efficient. They hit monasteries first. That's where the silver was. Then the villages. Then the estates. They took livestock by the hundreds. They took slaves by the dozens. They stripped the land of anything valuable and burned what they couldn't carry. The local Mercian forces? Scattered, outnumbered, watching from hilltops as their country burned. For weeks, the Vikings owned central England, and then success became a problem. Here's the thing about a really successful raid. Eventually, you have to carry everything home. The army that crossed into Mercia was fast, light, dangerous. The army that turned around to leave was slow, heavy, vulnerable. Think about it. Hundreds of cattle move at the speed of cattle. Wagons loaded with silver and gold move at the speed of wagons. Slaves, chained, terrified, stumbling, move at the speed of despair. The Vikings were strung out along miles of road. Their warriors were tired. Their horses were tired. They'd been in enemy territory for weeks, sleeping light, always watching. But they'd done it. They'd pulled off the biggest raid in years. The English king was still in Kent, probably just now getting his ships ready for a naval campaign that wouldn't matter. All they had to do was get home. They started the march north. They had no idea what was waiting for them. While the Vikings were burning their way through Mercia, something was happening that their scouts never saw. Edward wasn't stuck in Kent. Or rather, he had been. But somewhere in those weeks, while the Vikings were loading their wagons with plunder, Edward made a decision. The kind of decision that separates kings who survive from kings who get remembered. He abandoned the fleet. The ships could wait. The naval campaign could wait. Because Edward understood something the Vikings didn't. They'd given him an opportunity. They'd committed everything, their kings, their earls, their best warriors, to a single raid, deep in enemy territory. They'd put all their leadership in one place, and they thought he couldn't respond. They were wrong. What happened next required something almost impossible in the early medieval world. Coordination. Edward needed to move his West Saxon forces north from Kent, but he couldn't do it alone. His army wasn't big enough, and by the time he reached Mercia, the Vikings might already be gone. He needed Ethelfled, his sister, the Lady of the Mercians, the woman who'd been running Mercia alongside her husband for years, who knew the land, who had warriors of her own. Here's where the story becomes remarkable. Without telegraphs, without radios, without any of the instant communication we take for granted, Edward and Ethelfled coordinated a two-kingdom military operation across hundreds of miles, messengers riding through the night, prearranged signals, trust built over years of alliance, the system their father Alfred had created, the network of fortresses, the trained local forces, the communication lines, suddenly activated for something it had never done before. not defense. Attack. The West Saxons moved north. The Mercians moved east. Two armies converging on a single point. The Vikings had no idea. Their intelligence was old. Their scouts were watching the wrong roads. They still thought Edward was in Kent, still thought his army was waiting on ships. The trap was set. All they needed was for the Vikings to walk into it. The Viking column moved north through what's now the West Midlands. They were following the roads they knew, the routes they'd used for decades of raiding. They were maybe a day from safety, maybe two. The Danelaw border was close. Once they crossed it, they'd be in friendly territory, surrounded by allies, protected by the same fortresses that had kept the English out for a generation. They were so close. And then the rear of the column started dying. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is specific about what happened next. The English army came up with the rear of the Viking force. Not a head-on battle, not a glorious charge across an open field, a pursuit attack, an ambush. The English hit the back of the Viking column while it was strung out along the road, loaded down with plunder, completely unprepared for a fight. The location. Somewhere near Tettenhall and Wensfield, in what's now the suburbs of Wolverhampton. The terrain was broken, wooded in places, cut by streams and small valleys, perfect for an ambush, terrible for forming a shield wall. Picture what the Vikings faced. You're a warrior in the middle of the column. You've been marching for hours. Your shoulders ache from carrying loot. The man next to you is leading a stolen horse loaded with silver. Behind you, suddenly, screaming, you turn around. You can't see what's happening. The road bends. There are trees in the way. But you can hear it. Metal on metal. Men dying. Someone shouts that the English are attacking. But that's impossible. The English are in Kent. Everyone knows the English are in Kent. More screaming. Closer now. The men behind you start running forward, crashing into your section of the column. They're not fighting. They're fleeing. Wild-eyed. Some of them have dropped their weapons. And behind them, through the chaos, you see the English coming. Here's the thing about Viking warfare. It depends on the shield wall. That tight formation of interlocking shields, shoulder to shoulder, a fortress made of men. You cannot form a shield wall when you're being attacked from behind on a road. You cannot form a shield wall when your own fleeing men are crashing into you. You cannot form a shield wall when you're carrying 40 pounds of stolen silver and there's an English axe coming at your skull. The rear of the Viking column didn't break in battle. It shattered on contact. The English pushed forward, step by step, kill by kill. And here's where we need to talk about what we know versus what we can reasonably guess. No chronicle says Edward's archers did this specific thing. We don't have a detailed tactical breakdown. But we know bows were part of Anglo-Saxon warfare. We see them in the art. We read about them in the poetry. And in an ambush like this, against a packed, panicking column of men who can't form up, who can't raise their shields in formation, ranged weapons aren't just useful, they're devastating. You don't need elite longbowmen firing in synchronized volleys. You need men who can put arrows into a crowd. Every arrow that hits is a wound. Every wound slows someone down. Every man who falls blocks the road for the men behind him. The Vikings were being funneled, compressed, slaughtered, and at the front of the column the kings had a choice. Eowils and Halfdan, the two kings who'd led this army into Mercia, were probably near the front of the column. That's where leaders traveled. Away from the dust, first to reach safety. When the attack hit the rear, they had seconds to decide. Turn back, fight through their own fleeing men, uphill against the tide of panic, toward an enemy they couldn't see, or keep going, run for the border, save themselves and abandon the army. Neither choice was good. Both choices were lethal. We don't know exactly how the kings died. The chronicles don't give us their final moments. No dramatic last stands, no famous last words. What we know is simpler, starker, They didn't make it out. Somewhere in that chaos, maybe fighting, maybe running, maybe trampled by their own men, Eowulf and Halfdan died, the two most powerful Vikings in northern England, killed in a single afternoon. And they weren't alone. The collapse cascaded forward through the column like fire through dry grass. Earl Otur, dead. Earl Skurfa, dead. Hold after hold, name after name, the leadership class of the Northumbrian Danes gutted in hours. The chronicles use a simple word for what happened. The English fought them there. Not negotiated, not captured, not ransomed, fought. This was slaughter. This was annihilation. This was an English army that had caught its enemy helpless and showed no mercy. By the time the sun set on Tettenhall, thousands of Vikings lay dead along the roads of Mercia, and the two kings who'd led them to easy plunder were corpses being stripped by English soldiers. When dawn came, they counted the dead. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle lists the fallen with unusual precision. Not vague estimates, not many Vikings died. Names, titles. The kind of specificity that tells you the chroniclers understood they were recording something that mattered. King Eowulf, dead. King Halfdan, dead. Earl Otur, dead. Earl Skurfa, dead. And behind those names, many thousands of warriors. The chronicle doesn't give us an exact number. Medieval chroniclers rarely did. But the implication is clear. This wasn't a defeat. It was an extinction event. Two Viking kings killed in a single battle. Think about how rare that is. How impossible it should have been. Kings didn't fight in the front lines. Kings had bodyguards, the best warriors in the army, men whose only job was keeping their lord alive. Kings had horses. Kings had escape routes. For two kings to die in the same engagement meant the collapse was so complete, so total, that even the most protected men in the army couldn't get out. The Vikings hadn't just lost a battle. They'd lost a generation of leadership. The aftermath of Tettenhall reshaped England. In the months following the battle, the Northumbrian Danes turned on each other. With Eowulf and Halfdan dead, there was no clear succession. No unifying authority. Rival factions fought for control of York while their armies were still depleted from the disaster in Mercia. The Vikings had spent decades as the aggressors. They'd raided when they wanted, where they wanted. English kings had built walls and prayed and hoped the Northmen would go somewhere else. After Tettenhall, everything reversed. Large-scale Viking raids from the north essentially stopped, not because the Danes suddenly became peaceful, but because they couldn't. They didn't have the men, they didn't have the leaders, they didn't have the confidence. For an entire generation, the Vikings were broken. And Edward? Edward went hunting. With the threat from the north neutralized, Edward and Ethelfled shifted from defense to conquest. The next decade became a systematic dismantling of the Danelaw. They used Alfred's playbook, the Boer system, the network of fortresses, but they used it offensively. Build a fortress, garrison it, use it, as a base to take the next piece of territory. Build another fortress, repeat, town by town, region by region, year by year. Derby fell, Leicester fell, Nottingham fell. By 920, just 10 years after Tettenhall, Edward controlled almost everything south of the Humber River. The Danelaw, that vast Viking territory that had seemed permanent, unconquerable, was shrinking like ice in springtime. And it all traced back to one afternoon in Mercia. One ambush. One impossible trap. Here's what makes Tettenhall remarkable. It wasn't supposed to work. The Vikings had every advantage. Superior numbers, better intelligence, a clear escape route. They knew where Edward was, or thought they did. They'd done the math. They'd made the smart play. And they walked into a massacre. How? Because Edward understood something the Vikings didn't. Information decays. Intelligence gets old. The enemy you're watching today might not be where you expect tomorrow. The Vikings knew where Edward was when they started their raid. But raids take weeks, armies move, situations change. Edward used that gap, that window of outdated information. He moved his forces while the Vikings were blind, coordinated across 2 kingdoms, while the Vikings were counting their plunder. By the time the Viking scouts could have reported the danger, it was already too late. But Edward didn't do it alone. Ethelfled, the Lady of the Mercians, deserves equal credit for Tettenhall. Maybe more. She coordinated the Mercian forces. She knew the territory. She'd spent years building relationships with local commanders, understanding the roads and rivers and choke points of her kingdom. When Edward sent word that he was moving north, Ethelfled didn't hesitate. She mobilized her forces and moved to intercept. This was a family operation, brother and sister working across kingdom boundaries, trusting each other completely. Alfred had built the system, the fortresses, the trained armies, the communication networks. But Edward and Ethelfled proved that system could do something new. It could hunt. There's a moment in every battle where everything hangs in the balance. At Tettenhall, that moment came when the Vikings realized their intelligence was wrong. When they understood, too late, that Edward wasn't in Kent, that an English army was already behind them, that the easy raid had become a death trap. Imagine that realization spreading through the column. The veterans who'd raided for decades, who'd always known the escape routes, who'd always been faster than the English response, suddenly understanding that this time was different. The young warriors on their first major campaign, promised glory and plunder, now watching their leaders die around them. The kings, surrounded by chaos, watching their army disintegrate, knowing there was no way out. That moment of understanding. That's when Tettenhall was won. The Vikings had a word for what happened to them at Tettenhall. Or rather, they didn't. The Norse sagas barely mention it. The defeat was so complete, so humiliating, that it seems to have been deliberately forgotten. No songs about the brave dead, no tales of heroic last stands. Just silence. The English remembered, though. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded it carefully. This was the battle that proved the sons and daughters of Alfred were worthy of their father. This was the battle that broke the Vikings. So what's the lesson of Tettenhall? The Vikings made the oldest mistake in warfare. They assumed their enemy couldn't adapt. They had good intelligence. They had experience. They had numbers. They knew how the English had fought for decades. Defensive, reactive, always behind. But Edward wasn't defending. He wasn't reacting. He was waiting. Waiting for the Vikings to commit everything. Waiting for them to load themselves down with plunder. Waiting for them to start the long march home, tired and slow and vulnerable. And then he struck. The Vikings used to call this island Angle Land as a joke. The land of the Angles, the easy targets, the soft people who built monasteries full of silver and couldn't defend them. After Tettenhall, the joke stopped being funny. Edward the Elder proved he was exactly what the Vikings feared most. Not a king who built walls and hoped for peace. Not a king who waited for raids and prayed for survival. A hunter. A king who let his enemies commit, let them think they were safe, let them believe their own intelligence, and then closed the trap. 2 kings walked into Mercia in 910. Neither one walked out, and England, true England, unified England, was one step closer to being born.